For decades, Hollywood sold you a dream, a smile, the gloss, a hero who seems born to win. But to make the dream look real, the industry always loved one special effect: someone else's body put at risk. The stunt on screen lasts seconds. Off-screen, it's a contract, a schedule, and a cold, "let's do another take." Sometimes a doctor shows up, who's supposed to say everything is fine. Sometimes a tabloid, which calls an injury romantic, so no one ruins the party. Today, 10 stories about how danger was turned into a job requirement. And each next one will be darker. And the final one will remind you that in this game, it's not just horses and sets that fall. The dream becomes an assembly line, and the payback doesn't come right away. First bruises, then broken bodies, then silence. And we'll start with a man who was sold to the public as a real cowboy without fear. Tom Mix did his own stunts because the legend couldn't afford a double, and it's with this myth on horseback that it all begins. Tom Mix was sold as a real cowboy, as if he wasn't acting, but just living life on camera. The public needed a hero who wasn't afraid of horses, heights, or speed. And here's the first cold shower. Tom Mix wasn't a Texan, and he wasn't that legendary ranger. He was born in Pennsylvania, then drifted around Oklahoma, worked as a bartender, and only after that ended up in the movies. And the fancy biography that newspapers loved to print, according to historians, was deliberately built up by the studio. It wasn't decoration, it was a tool. The stronger the myth about the real frontier hero, the easier it is to demand stunts from him with no right to refuse. If you're supposedly made of steel, then any injury just looks like part of the image. Mix did his own stunts, in nearly 300 films, and very quickly, the Fox studio built a separate lot for his westerns, Mixville, to churn out spectacle on an assembly line. For this, they paid him an amount that sounds like a fairy tale. In the early 20s, he was getting up to $17,500 a week. But the fairy tale bought one thing: the chance to risk his body again and again for a shot. He himself talked about a week of shooting where 1 minute a team of horses flies off a cliff, the next a horse jumps over a chasm, then another fall and another rise. The ugliest detail is that some stunts were repeated several times just because someone wanted a prettier picture. And that's still the easy level. Later in this feature, you'll hear how this approach was blown up to a scale where several people would be in danger at once. The studio didn't hide the consequences, it traded on them. A promotional flyer survives where Mix's injuries were listed as achievements. He was maimed in stunts dozens of times. Accidental injuries happened on set, and even that was turned into a reason to admire him. His bones became the special effect. Somewhere near his favorite spots hung a diagram of the human body with marks for wounds and fractures, like a treasure map. For the audience, it was a thrill ride. For him, it was a memory that hurts with every movement. And then sound came, and Hollywood showed its second favorite trick. A legend can be turned off when it stops selling. After a dispute over money, Mix left Fox, and at other studios, his former role no longer gave him the same protection. In the early 30s, he was even given the rare right to approve scripts and actors. Looks good on paper, until you find out the series had to be stopped because of injuries sustained during filming. When the body gets tired, no contract clauses can save you. In the mid-30s, he starred in his last project and never returned to the screen. And the industry that made him an icon left him with circus tours and Wild West shows. A party for the public, survival for the man. He died on a road in Arizona, and there's a cruel symbolism in that death. A heavy aluminum suitcase hit him so hard that he died almost instantly. Now that dented suitcase lies in a museum, as if iron is more important than talking about the price. The worst part is, the studio didn't even have to apologize. The legend had done its work, and silence closed the door. And behind that door already stands a man who would fall instead of the stars, and figure out how to do it and survive. Yakima Canutt is the man who taught Hollywood how to shoot dangerous stunts so the stars stayed in one piece. It's just that, at first, they weren't trying to keep him in one piece. He was sold to the public as the ideal cowboy, a champion, calm, confident, as if born in the saddle. But inside, it was work to the point of exhaustion. In the mid-20s, he crashed during filming and broke his nose, and when it healed, he joked that he looked even better now. Then he started inventing things that should never have been born in a stuntman's mind. A simple detail so your foot wouldn't get stuck in the stirrup when you're thrown from the saddle. Cables and rigging to fall gracefully but not die. He built safety with his own hands because the studios were only building the schedule. And that's where Hollywood arithmetic kicks in. In the 30s, stuntmen were paid a daily rate with no real protection. Can't work? You don't get paid. Breakdown today? Tomorrow, you're just not on the list. Posters scream about heroism, but behind the scenes, it's all about the payroll. Canutt's most famous stunt happened in the late 30s in the Western Stagecoach. He jumped from his horse onto a speeding stagecoach, took a bullet according to the script, and fell between the horses so that the team and the coach itself passed right over him. His safety rule sounded like a joke. Drive faster, then the horses run straighter. You lie in the dust and pray the geometry holds up. The crew doubted they'd got the shot. The director, reportedly, said he wouldn't shoot that again. Nice. And the reward was even nicer, the promise of new pictures. Meaning new risks. In the mid-30s, Canutt worked for Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer and doubled for Clark Gable. A girl panicked on set, and Canutt first pushed her out from under a falling wall, leaving no room for himself. Result? Broken ribs. For the studio, his ribs were just a delay in the shooting schedule. He healed and came back. A few years later, again doubling the same actor in another film, a bad fall from a horse ended in intestinal surgery. That's what the deal looks like. You save the shot, then the doctors fix you, and it's considered a cost of doing business. At Republic Pictures, he churned out westerns, doubled for stars, and filled any gaps in the scenes. Reportedly, injuries there were often recorded as minor delays or simply ignored in the paperwork. And once, he broke both ankles falling from a wagon. The scariest part of this story isn't even his fractures. The scariest part is that he became the safety department himself, because there was no one else. In the late 50s, he was designing stunts not with his body, but with calculations. For Ben-Hur, he devised a protection system for the chariot race and hired his own son, Joe, to double the lead actor. And right there, his son's chariot hit an obstacle, flew up, and Joe was thrown forward over the front. His chin was cut open, but he held onto the chariot. According to reports from stuntmen on set, Canutt went pale as if he'd already lost his son. He'd spent his whole life building rules so no one would die. And Hollywood still tried to take its toll every single time. Later, he was given an honorary Oscar for his contribution to stunt work and safety. He was 70. A thank you that comes this late sounds especially bitter when you remember how many times before it was all just written off as a delay. And now, another stuntman from that era who was also given a fake name to sound more American and then had his accent turned into a brand. Richard Talmadge entered Hollywood with a German voice and a surname that was handed to him like a costume. Richard Talmadge is that man Hollywood likes to pretend never existed. In the film database, next to his work, the same thing appears again and again. Uncredited. Convenient, right? Actually, he was born in Germany, and his name was Sylvester Metz. The irony is that even that name was mixed up in paperwork, as if from the very beginning they were preparing him for the role of a man without a signature. His family lived on air, circus acrobats, flying acts, risk measured not by emotions but by centimeters. In the late 1910s, his brothers did something in the arena that no one had done before, a quadruple backflip. And Sylvester was the catcher, not the one shining in the spotlight, but the one holding someone else's life in his hands. Hollywood saw a guy like that and made its first move. They gave him a different name. The surname Talmadge was borrowed from the famous acting sisters because it sounded like box office gold. As if you can rename a person and he'll become as sellable as a poster. Then the work began, work that couldn't be named. He doubled for stars, did stunts for Tom Mix, and most importantly, for Douglas Fairbanks Sr., the main smiling hero of silent film. On screen, Fairbanks jumps over rooftops and flies into the void. But in the most dangerous corners, according to film researchers, it was Talmadge under his costume. And here's the knot you can't wash off. The studios didn't just ask for silence. It was vitally important to them that the audience believe in the star's personal courage. The brand relies on the myth, and the myth can't stand a second body in the frame. So Talmadge got work, but lost the right to his own name. And try to refuse when your name is already someone else's. He tried to step out of the shadows and play lead roles for cheap independent companies, where they shot fast and poor on so-called Poverty Row. In the early 20s, he was a one-man action department. Think up a stunt, act, fall, get up, smile, move on. He even started his own little company, Richard Talmadge Productions, to at least have some control over his work. But control in Hollywood often looks like this. You only control exactly how you take the risk. The most telling moment is the mid-20s, the film The Prince of Pep. According to researchers' descriptions, Talmadge jumps from a roof across an alley and lands through a window of the neighboring building. No wire, no net, and no right to a second take, because the poor studio might not have had the money or the man for a second take. His talent was turned into absence. And then sound came, and fate played its meanest trick. His acting career didn't end because of falls or age. He never got rid of his German accent, and with the arrival of talkies, they just stopped casting him on screen. Falling was okay. Speaking was not. He went behind the camera and worked for decades as a stunt coordinator and second unit director on dozens of projects. In the 60s, he's linked to the big stunt sequence in the film Circus World with John Wayne. And later, he worked on staging the finale of the spoof Casino Royale. He was already over 70, and he was still putting together the action that brought glory to others. And the final touch that makes you want to curse the studio gods. After his death, the name on his tombstone had his real surname mixed up again. As if Hollywood never really learned who it had used for all those years. But it gets even more cynical. Because there are people who were silent not for decades, but for an entire lifetime, and did it for someone else's image, someone else's posters, and someone else's box office. Harvey Parry was one of them. Harvey Parry was the guy who made the stars invincible, and then disappeared from the credits. He was particularly easy to sell. Short, light, a former circus aerial acrobat from San Francisco. At first, he hauled props and got $30 a week. And then he saw another Hollywood rate, $1 for every foot of a fall, and $35 for smashing up a car on screen. And the choice became too simple. And here's the important part. They paid him for the height, but they didn't pay for the consequences. In the late 1910s, he came to work at Mack Sennett's studio and entered a trade where the question wasn't how to do it, but how to survive. A casting director might come out and ask who wants to earn $10. People agreed without asking what exactly they'd have to do. And then they'd find out it was a jump from a roof. Pause. Harvey Parry doubled for Harold Lloyd in long shots where you could see the ground under his feet. In that very film Safety Last, where the hero hangs from a huge clock on the face of a skyscraper. The public was supposed to believe the actor did it all himself. That was his brand, his box office, his legend. And Harvey was silent for decades. According to sources, he only talked about his work after Lloyd's death, about half a century later. Not because he was ashamed, because it was taboo. The one thing he wasn't allowed to have was publicity. Hollywood bought his falls piece by piece and erased his name in bulk. And yes, the studios used him like a universal costume. Today he could be on a horse instead of John Wayne, shot from a distance. Tomorrow he could double for Clark Gable or Humphrey Bogart. And once, in his own words, he portrayed Shirley Temple and held the reins of a wildly careening team of horses. In a dress. For a shot. You'd think after that, they'd at least take care of you. But Hollywood doesn't take care of what it considers expendable. In the mid-30s, on the set of the Jack London adaptation, The Call of the Wild, he was doubling for Clark Gable and broke his back. The film came out, the star kept smiling, and about the stuntman's broken back, the studio, reportedly, made no fuss at all. No posters, no gratitude, no human pause. He recovered and came back. Because that's how this job works. You either come back or you disappear without a trace. Many years later, in the early 60s, on the big western How the West Was Won, they sent him to do a stunt jumping from a water tower. The landing zone calculation was off, and Harvey broke 20 bones in one foot. 20. In one leg. After that, the spring in his jumps was gone forever, and small rolls and bit parts became more and more common. You'd think, that's it, the end. But no. In the early 80s, when he was already over 80, he was still doing stunts. In one episode, he played a cop being pushed into a door by a crowd of reporters. And they reshot that scene 12 times. 12 times the old man hit the wall and fell to the floor, for $330 a day. Not death on camera, but a life that became a series of takes. He died in the mid-80s from a heart attack, still going to work. And when you hear the word legend, remember, he was made a legend only because he agreed to be invisible. And next, Hollywood would raise the stakes into the air, where instead of bones, metal breaks, and a mistake no longer looks like a bruise. Paul Mantz knew that risk better than anyone. Paul Mantz was the guy Hollywood called when they needed to do the impossible and make it look like it was just part of the movie magic. On the outside, he was almost a fairy tale character. He had his own aviation company in Burbank, and according to press reports, he flew celebrities to get married in Las Vegas so often that he called it the Honeymoon Express himself. A flying Cupid, making money not from flowers but from propellers. But that smile had another mode. Early on, he'd been an aviation cadet in the Army and got kicked out after flying too low over his own commander's train. Hollywood heard about that and thought, perfect. We need a guy who chooses to fly that close on his own. In the early 30s, he put on a demonstration and did 46 consecutive outside loops. Not for sport, so the studios would see the product. After that, the product became movies. According to one source, his private fleet of planes was called the 7th largest in the world. He shot aerial scenes for hundreds of films, including big war dramas. And every time, the camera demanded an angle, a speed, and a risk that an airplane isn't obligated to forgive. In the late 40s, he was hired for a stunt that itself sounds like a controlled disaster. Land a heavy B-17 Flying Fortress bomber on its belly without landing gear. He did it alone, without a co-pilot. For that single sequence, he was paid $4,500, which at the time was considered insane money. Only the studio didn't remember the sum. The studio remembered that this footage could be played again and again. According to aviation historians, the shots were used for many years afterward in other films. His risk was leased to the studio in perpetuity. And this is where it gets truly vile. When a stunt outlives the performer, the industry calls it a legacy. When the performer asks for a share, they're told he was just hired help. The scariest episode happened in the mid-60s on the set of a film about survivors of a plane crash who build a new airplane from the wreckage. For the shot, they built a real flying machine, deliberately made to look like a homemade job. And according to the investigation, it had known problems. A heavy nose, poor handling on landing, weak construction. That day, Mantz wasn't even supposed to fly. He agreed to replace his partner, who was temporarily sidelined due to an injury. He was given minimal preparation time, and the film crew was already waiting for a beautiful pass over the desert. He made a low approach, a touch, acceleration, and an attempt to pull up again. And the plane came apart right in the frame. The cameras didn't stop. Mantz died instantly, and the stuntman who was with him in the cockpit survived but was severely injured. And then they flipped Hollywood's favorite switch. The official investigation blamed the pilot and mentioned alcohol. Friends and family disputed this, talking about the heat and the delay at the crash site. But the studio found one thing convenient. Responsibility leaves with the body that can no longer object. The film came out a few months later, got nominations, and they put a memorial card on screen. One card for a death recorded on film and filed away in the archives. And if you think the horror in this story is the accident itself, just wait. Next, Hollywood would kill not just with a stunt, but with the silence around a person when they're no longer needed. That's exactly how the story of Karl Dane begins. Karl Dane was sold to you as the warm, slightly goofy favorite of silent film. He makes the audience laugh, and a minute later suddenly makes them feel pain, because there's a real weariness in his eyes. In The Big Parade, he played Slim so well that audiences didn't just laugh, they felt for him. But it all started in a very un-Hollywood way. He was Danish, born in Copenhagen, came to America, and quickly became convenient material for Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. A recognizable face, great physicality, simple human humor. After the success of The Big Parade, he was getting $1,500 a week. The studio held on to him like a golden asset and smiled exactly until the moment he needed to speak. When the microphone arrived, they called him in for voice tests and decided his thick Danish accent would be hard for a wide audience to understand. His partner in comedy films, the British actor George Arthur, was considered more suitable. And Karl, according to the facts in his file, was offered no coaching, no help to adapt. They just stamped him, inconvenient. And with that, the fairy tale ended. What followed was a streak where every new step looks like trying to stay on ice barefoot. He and Arthur went on a 23-week theater variety tour under the Paramount umbrella. The tour ended, and they were finished too. He tried to save himself with business and got into a mining company. According to documented data, it all fell apart in less than a year. Then he returned to the stage alone, as a comedian, and critics panned his act so badly it quickly disappeared. And he returned to film on a humiliating scale. A tiny role as a dispatcher in the serial The Whispering Shadow, starring Bela Lugosi. Not long before, he'd been the face of a major film. Now he was a man at a desk whom almost no one would notice. And here's where Hollywood performs the coldest part of the trick. He falls not just in money, he falls in status. Towards the end of 33, he bought a share in a small hot dog stand. The story about it being at the studio gate, according to his file, is partly embellished, but the main point is confirmed. The business failed because his former colleagues avoided him. They felt awkward standing next to someone who'd already been crossed out. And he still went back. Not to ask for a role, to ask for any kind of work, even as an extra, even carrying lumber. He wanted $5 a day, and they turned him away. His accent became a sentence, and the studio's silence his tombstone. A few days before his death, according to the biography in his file, he was robbed on his way home, and they took all the money he had, $18. In April of 34, he was found in his apartment in Los Angeles, a revolver at his feet. Nearby lay a short suicide note for Francis and friends, and an album he carried with him. Old contracts, clippings, praise, proof that he really was someone, not a fabrication. Francis Lee, upon seeing him, reportedly fainted. The police attached a note to his body saying he might have relatives in Denmark and spent several days looking for his family, even placing ads in Copenhagen newspapers. His relatives only found out later, and the studio that once made money off him released no statement. Later, they posthumously gave him a star on the Walk of Fame. It cost nobody a cent. And if you think it gets easier now, it doesn't. Next, we go to where a person isn't crossed out by a single decision. There, they're worn down over years, fall after fall, until the body becomes a collection of someone else's victories. That brings us to Lyons. Cliff Lyons lived a life in Hollywood that they'll never show you in the credits. For almost 50 years, he made sure that on-screen, the hero looked immortal, while off-screen, only the schedule was immortal. They even tried to sell him to the public. In the late 20s, posters called him Tex, and he got lead roles in silent westerns. But that didn't last long, and then he moved to where a name just gets in the way of the work. He was born on a farm in South Dakota, and even his birth date floats in the sources. Sometimes July 1st, sometimes the 4th, a prettier, more patriotic date. As if the industry was learning from the very beginning to tailor reality to a convenient legend. Before film, he went to business school in Memphis. And then in 1921, his father died, and 20-year-old Cliff put together a rodeo troupe and toured the fairs. By the early 20s, he was in California, and they'd hire him just as a writer. By the day, with no promises, no protection, no right to negotiate terms. This is where the real squeeze begins. You fall, you dust yourself off, you check if the horse is okay, and you hear the same thing. Let's do it again, we need it cleaner. Say no today, tomorrow they just won't call you. In the late 20s, he even worked on huge productions like the first Ben-Hur and Beau Geste. The files state clearly that on such shoots, people and horses were maimed, and sometimes deaths occurred. But on the posters, faces lived, and in the dust lived those who held the shot. And here's a moment that shows who Hollywood really protects. In 1938, on Lake of the Ozarks, they needed to save Tyrone Power's face for a close-up. So Cliff got on a horse, galloped, and went off a cliff 70 feet high with it, straight into the water. He was on the horse when it fell. He was in the water when a boat came up. But the horse drowned. The public was outraged, and after this, according to the files, new oversight rules were introduced to protect animals on set. Sounds nice, right? Only those rules weren't about him. The man who did the stunt got no extra protection, no new standards specifically for those who fall down with the horse. The star's face was saved in advance, the studio's reputation was covered afterwards, and the stuntman remained the same-day worker. His life was a disposable part for someone else's legend. And yet, he wasn't just a performer. He worked alongside Yakima Canutt, and then he himself became the one who builds action for the big names. He coordinated action in 15 films for John Ford and John Wayne. Later, he participated in staging the massive battle scenes in the film The Alamo, where dozens are at risk, and a mistake sounds like a crunch, not an oops. Colleagues remembered him as a man who pushes for the perfect take. Sounds harsh, but in this profession, softness often equals funerals. He pushed for precision because he knew the price of imprecision. According to the facts in the files, towards the end of his career, he joined the board of the Screen Actors Guild and helped create the Stuntmen's Hall of Fame, donating his photos and work bag. Because studios don't keep memories, they spend them. He died in Los Angeles at St. Vincent's Hospital, already over 70. And after everything he did, he had a letter from John Wayne and recognition in places the audience has almost never heard of. Now imagine the same thing, but with a woman who also had to prove she had the right to take risks. Helen Gibson enters this story not as an exception, but as the next bill on the same tab. Helen Gibson is a name Hollywood turned into a convenient label, but she was born Rose Wenger, a girl from Cleveland who got hooked early on horses, speed, and risk. In the early 1910s, she ended up in rodeo. The season ended in Venice, California, and the troupe latched onto film. Rose was paid $8 a week, and she'd ride 5 miles to the set and 5 miles back just to earn something. Then she auditioned, got a raise to $15, and got her first named role in the credits. But the real work began when the studio needed someone else's body instead of an expensive face. In 1914, she was chosen as the double for 14. She was chosen as the double for Helen Holmes, the star of the railroad serial The Hazards of Helen. Holmes was brave herself, But for one particular stunt, an insurance inspector came and said the star couldn't do it. And this is how it's done. The name is protected, and the risk is shifted onto someone who can be replaced. Rose was supposed to jump from a pair of galloping horses onto a cable under a bridge and swing onto it to land on a moving locomotive. The inspector refused to insure it and called her a bad risk. The studio didn't rewrite the scene and didn't stop. They just went ahead without insurance. Rose made the jump, slammed into the locomotive cab, and the doctor advised her to spend a week in the infirmary. She brushed it off and went back to the set. Because in this profession, a pause looks like a firing. The serial was cranked out to 119 episodes, and almost every one relied on some dangerous railroad stunt. She was advertised as the most daring actress in films, as if it were an award. In reality, it was a trap. When you're sold as a woman with no double, any new risk is declared your duty. Her bones became part of the budget. And another studio move, not a pretty one. Rose was forced to take the stage name Helen Gibson so the audience wouldn't notice the substitution. And the surname came from her husband, Hoot Gibson. For the studio, the signboard is what matters. Who's inside is a secondary question. After the serial, she was promised stability with contracts. But stability had a way of dissolving. The biggest paycheck of her career, $300 a week at a small company, vanished when the company folded before she could even work out the contract. Then she ended up in the hospital with a burst appendix, and the studio simply replaced her while she was recovering. A little later, another company hired her for a Western, went bankrupt, and paid no one. On set, she was injured on a horse and ended up back in the hospital. To pay for treatment, she sold her furniture, jewelry, and car. You'd think after that, you'd leave for good. But she stayed in the profession and for decades doubled for other actresses. Wherever they needed to ride horseback, fall, handle a wagon, do what a star couldn't do. In 35, she married a studio electrician, Clifton Johnson, and became the treasurer of the Association of Stunt Girls. The very fact that they had to organize separately says it all. The industry wasn't building any support structures for them. And the bitterest detail. In the early 60s, they called her for a small role in a John Ford film. The scene was shot, and she was paid $35. In January of that decade, she retired with a payment of $200 a month plus Social Security. The woman who practically opened this line of work ended it on pennies. Next comes a story about speed and records, where risk looks glamorous right up until the moment the body stops obeying. Kitty O'Neill will open that door with the next step. Kitty O'Neill was the person the system should never have let reach the top. She had been deaf since she was 4 months old, after a severe illness in infancy, and at 18, she was officially told there would be no work for her because she was deaf. Imagine what a door like that sounds like when you're already living in silence. She didn't go asking for permission. She went to train. Swimming, gymnastics, acrobatics, diving, all at once, as if her body had to prove to the world what her ears no longer could. At 16, she was a candidate for the U.S. Olympic diving team, and then her body struck again with illnesses, so big sports shattered like glass. But Hollywood loves people who don't know how to give up. It just loves them exactly as long as they're convenient to use. On set, Kitty became the ideal solution. They put her where they couldn't risk the star's face. She doubled for Linda Carter in the Wonder Woman series, doubled for Lindsay Wagner in The Bionic Woman. She did jumps that others looked at and said no to. There's a confirmed record, a jump from a height of 180 feet onto an airbag, and there was a jump from the roof of a 12-story building for a TV series. The silence around her wasn't a weakness, it was concentration. And here's an unexpected detail. Colleagues recalled that the stunt coordinator had to get very close so Kitty could read his lips or arrange visual signals in advance. Meaning, when filming turned into chaos, you couldn't just yell stop, she had to see it. And now, the main thing. On December 6, 1976, in the Alvord Desert in Oregon, Kitty rocketed a rocket car to a speed of 621 miles per hour. The fastest woman on Earth. And that sounds like a title that should have opened everything for her. But Hollywood and the sponsors know how to pull a stunt without cameras. Her manager, Duff Moore, forced her to sign an agreement stating that this record would be considered a women's record and, at the same time, be classified as unofficial. The logic was nasty and simple. It's more profitable for corporations to sell a male record, and a female record holder is commercially inconvenient. They promise contracts and a big future, but they took away the most important word in her biography. Her record was stolen in a whisper. She kept working, as if she hadn't been zeroed out. By the time she retired, she had 22 speed records on land and water, and even on snow. And one more fact that Hollywood doesn't like to emphasize. She became the first woman accepted into the elite stunt organization, Stunts Unlimited. Seems like a victory, until you remember it's a victory in a world where winners aren't protected. In 1982, she left the profession after witnessing colleagues die during performances, not because she was scared, because she realized her own fate could also become someone's convenient headline, and again there would be fine print at the bottom. And when you hear about speed and records, remember, in this industry, even a victory can turn out to be someone else's property. And next is a story where the stakes aren't a career or a title, but life itself, right there on camera. Vic Morrow got into a helicopter like it was a regular workday. Vic Morrow wasn't the man from the shadows. Millions knew his face from the war series Combat, where he played Sergeant Saunders for 7 seasons. The show ran on the ABC television network, won 4 Emmy Awards, and Morrow himself got a nomination. For television in those years, that was almost a crown. But a crown starts to pinch quickly. Morrow was frustrated being typecast, and in the early 80s, he was looking for a role that would restore his cinematic scale. He needed to prove he wasn't just a tough commander from the trenches, but an actor who could be dangerous, pathetic, and alive all at once. And then a project came along that sounded right. An anthology based on the classic TV show The Twilight Zone. Warner Brothers Studio. Big-name directors. A serious theme. Morrow takes the role of a man who first hates outsiders and then finds himself in their shoes. A part like that doesn't come along often, and he agreed. And then begins what Hollywood loves more than talent: acceleration. Night. A location in Valencia, the sand of Indian dunes. The crew works from 9 in the evening. By 2 in the morning, they're shooting the final scene. Morrow walking through a river under a helicopter and explosions, carrying 2 Vietnamese children in his arms. The children were played by 7-year-old Micah Din Lee and 6-year-old Renee Shin Yi Chen. According to case files, they were hired illegally, without state permission, for cash, and their parents weren't informed there would be night shooting with pyrotechnics. Not because they didn't know the rules, because the rules got in the way of the shot. There it is, the Hollywood exchange. You want more powerful explosions and a lower helicopter so the audience believes it. In payment, you take away people's right to say no and their right to be protected by the law at all. Shortly before the take, according to testimony at the trial, the director ordered charges placed right in the water, under the flight path. The helicopter was flying at about 25 feet. The pilot, according to the prosecution, was not officially warned that the explosions would now be closer and stronger. At 2:20 in the morning, the charges went off. The aircraft lost control and fell right where Morrow and the children were standing in the river. Several cameras were recording it all live. The bank watched. His contract ended with the rotor blades. And this isn't the end of the nightmare, but the beginning of the paperwork part. The prosecution filed charges against the director, producers, the unit production manager, and the pilot. The trial lasted 10 months, and after almost 5 years, the jury said one word: not guilty on all counts. According to case files, the courtroom applauded, and the director smiled at the jury. Warner Brothers released the film less than a year later. That very segment was left in the release. The director's career continued as if no one had died that night. there's one detail that makes things especially quiet. Morrow had 2 daughters, Jennifer Jason Leigh and Carrie Ann. And when he's on screen carrying other people's children through the river, it looks like a scene about rescue. But in reality, it was a scene where an adult man shields himself from someone else's risk. And now these 10 stories converge on a single point. Hollywood loves spectacle, loves speed, and loves for responsibility to dissolve in the night. All that's left is to put it all together into one picture, where you can hear who stepped on the gas and how. Here's what happened over and over again. First, they sell you the storefront, a hero who supposedly does it all himself, a smile, a legend, a record, fearlessness. Then they turn up the quiet pressure, the contract, the schedule, the reputation, the silence in the credits, and the eternal, let's do another take, until it's perfect. And then the bill comes, and it's not paid by the ones whose faces are on the posters. Here, danger was always currency. They packaged it nicely, put it on an assembly line, and when the irreparable happened, they switched on Hollywood's oldest magic trick, blur the responsibility. An injury became an anecdote, a death became an accident, and a person became a line they didn't have to print. And the ugliest part isn't even the risk. The ugliest part is how easily they swap the words. They call bravery professionalism. They call wear and tear experience. And they call silence respect, as if not saying a name out loud will make the pain less. It seems like this is some museum horror from black and white footage, but look closer. The industry still loves the same trick today, pretending that luck and talent cancel out the limits of the body. It's just the sets are newer, and the pressure has learned to smile even more politely. Where there should be a stop, more often you hear, "Come on, you've got this." And there's always an agent, a doctor, or a tabloid nearby to carefully explain why this is normal and even beautiful. And as long as the spectacle sells, there will always be someone who is told they have to be convenient. Faster, lower, more dangerous, just no complaints, just no pauses. And the people in these stories weren't madmen. They were the working stiffs of a dream. They went where it was scary because it was their craft, their chance, their only way to stay needed. And here's the truth you can't hide from. Hollywood knows how to give a standing ovation, but it doesn't know how to hold your hand when the lights go out. If you think this is the limit, you've only seen the surface layer. This industry has other ways of breaking people, much quieter and dirtier than a stunt on a set. And some of them sound like a regular contract, like friendly advice, like concern.